Hello, good evening, and welcome. I'm Simon Bestwick.
And I'm Gemma Files, and this is, of course, No
No
Darkness
darkness,
But
but
Ours.
ours. Welcome to the second part of this special edition of No Darkness But Ours, in which we interview Hailey Piper, author of The Worm and His Kings, The Possession of Natalie Glasgow, and No Gods for Drowning, among many other titles, about horror, queerness, and her ongoing mission to, in her own words, make horror gay as fuck.
I definitely find that when you're a working writer, um, there's that sort of, again, the back and forth between the stuff that you build from the bottom up and at your own speed, and the stuff that almost metastasizes, because somebody is giving you a deadline from the outside. Somebody's saying,
Right.
"Oh, what if you wrote this?" And you're like, "What if I wrote this?" The humor, suddenly
It's amazing. It's
pops
amazing
out.
what a good stimulus, a sort of cash advance can.
Yeah, well, there's that. You get advances?
The first ever novel. Once you had to. They commissioned off the basis of a sample chapter and an outline chapter breakdown. So once they
Right.
accepted that, they sent you got like half, I think half in advance, and then the rest on completion. I always liked to remind the editor, because it was a zombie novel, and he rang up and said, "So do you like to write a zombie novel for me then?" And I sort of, to be sarcastic, "Well, actually, I'm kind of moving more into sort of bodice ripping romance now. Hey, there's an idea: Pride and Prejudice with zombies." And I actually
Yeah.
came up with an idea that was basically set in, had Mr. Darcy as a secret agent using French zombies at the Battle of Waterloo, and then they turned them loose after the war to try and stop all the civil unrest in Britain after the Napoleonic Wars, and it all goes a bit Pete Tong. And I pitched that to him, and I said, "No, I think we'll just stick with what we've got at the moment." But I do like to remind him he was the editor who turned down Pride and Prejudice with zombies, even if not the even if
Yes,
not
and
the yeah.
and a considerably more interesting version, as opposed to,
I'd like
well,
to think.
we're literally going to rewrite Pride and Prejudice with zombies. Just insert zombies.
I was giving it a call it Pride and Extreme Prejudice. It was it would be great,
That's funny. Okay, so
but yeah, that kind of thing. There's the necessity. Necessity is the mother of invention, and all that. So yeah, there is something to be said for that. But you do, yeah, absolutely have to remember why we started doing this to begin with. Um, God knows it wasn't for the money.
that is absolutely true. And that's we come back to the masturbatory element. Um, it's like, are you just trying to make yourself happy? Yes, yes, I am.
I've always
Myself
remembered.
happy and hopefully other people happy.
Yeah. I think there's like a necessity because again, it comes down to like, well, you're kind of arrogant. It's like, yeah, I mean, why is that looked at as a problem though
Mm,
when you are creating art? Like again, it's that expectation of shame. Like, why are you trying to make people feel things? Why are you feeling things? It's like that's only a problem if you look at everyone and everything as this big machine.
yeah,
Um,
Yes.
and it's
Yeah.
just like I think a lot of art is just yeah, you do need to be harsh critic. I think it comes down to just flexible shamelessness.
oh, I love
Um,
that.
Yes. I love that. It's a Yeah. Which Okay. So the last thing that we were talking about was lesbian horror. We had moved through from general queer horror and gay male horror to lesbian horror. I was thinking about how inextricable, to some degree, the body is from queer horror, and how that often when you try to make a distinction between one type of queer horror and another type of queer horror, you do find yourself getting into these weird metaphors, which are very much like a dick versus a vagina. It's sort of like, it's like, it's where you're sucking stuff inside of yourself and then undermining it somehow. You changing it, you spit it out in a different way. You're just like, but I was thinking about Lovecraftiana and the way that the way that queerness has penetrated Lovecraftiana and is sort of changing it in an almost topping from below kind of way, in much the same way that people of color are seizing onto the tropes of Lovecraftiana and trying to, and bending them, and going like, what if Lovecraft, but not racist,
Well, yes.
What if Lovecraft, but not afraid of vaginas or squid, and
or squid with vaginas, why not? Yes.
Yeah, exactly. What do you think the appeal is with Lovecraft? Lovecraftian tropes, shall we say?
Well, I think, I mean, some of it is just because cosmic horror, I think, is fun to dabble in, especially if you're someone who likes some wonder and awe in your horror.
Yes.
But also, I think there's kind of a not exactly like trying to subvert Lovecraft necessarily, but it is almost necessary to do so in responding, because Lovecraft presents horror as this in a lot of stories. I don't want to say that Lovecraft only does one thing, but in a lot of stories presents it as if there is society and it is this good thing and it is the way things should be and people should be proud of it, and then zooming out to show it as this completely unimportant, irrelevant thing that can be easily messed up and broken by the uncaring universe and all the horrible things that exist in it.
Yes.
And I think that the appeal for authors from marginalized groups is that we don't see society as this shining beacon in a universe of darkness or something. It's that darkness can be a comforting place, because society has been cruel with its light. It has been is burned, it has cut, it has stamped down, is crushed. Yeah. And so when you have this possibility that everything outside of that is just chaos sounds nice. Chaos sounds comforting.
Yes.
I think, like, that if you have, I think it's in The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Laval, where there's a part after the main character suffers a tragedy I don't want to spoil, but he thinks about the terror that certain men have of an uncaring universe, and he says he wishes the universe didn't care. Like that would be relief compared to the cruelty.
Yes, the deliberate cruelty,
right,
of a universe that you inhabit from birth on, where people seem to care very much about hurting you for being who you are.
Yes.
And there's that subtext. I mean, during the 80s, the horror that we sort of grew up with. I hesitate to say the Kingian horror model, but the Kingian horror model, because, he's not always like that. He's been around long enough that he's really tried to change that, that sort of like...
He's experimented, I want to say.
Yeah, but that idea that, there's, things are good, and then something from the outside comes in and tries to change the good things, and... but after struggle, things get better again, as the thing from the outside is rejected to some degree. But if you think of yourself as the thing from the outside that has to be rejected, it's like when people talk about horror as being an inherently othering genre, but I agree, the monstrous, supposedly, is absolutely attractive. And I think if you love horror, 9 times out of 10 you're attracted to it because you have an affinity for the monstrous, an affinity for to say and a real feeling that you want to say, yes, I am not like you, maybe, but that's not awful. It is not awful to be the way I am. And maybe you are like me as too, maybe we're all the other. Have you thought about that?
And I do think, I mean, you can tell different kinds of stories that way, where you can have characters from traditionally othered backgrounds fighting a monster, or you can have something where the other is the monster, or, there's lots of ways to explore it. Because on another ground, you can have an outside thing coming in, and it is a problem, in a colonization type of scenario.
Absolutely.
Like the context is everything. So yeah, but I do agree with you. Largely, we do feel like I think Frankenstein's monster is the classic example of where we do feel for what is supposed to be the monster. Although I would even argue that that's not even the case in the original text. That's something that larger society kind of reinterpreted it into, that this is the monster and it's a problem.
Yeah. Well, it certainly seems to me that Mary Shelley was very much interested in the idea that no, perhaps the true monster is a guy who looks at his child and goes, "Ah, you're so ugly. I didn't realize that until you were moving around."
I assembled you out of corpses, stitched them crudely together, and you don't.
And it's your fault.
Exactly. It's almost like that inherent thing that we don't want to think about in terms of parenting, which is where one day you look at your child and they're an individual, and you don't understand what's going on inside them necessarily. They're another human being thinking their own thoughts. And on some level, you're like, not just, oh, that's really cool. You're like, oh, all right, you're a whole other person. Why did I do that? Why did I make a whole other person who now scream at me and go, no? Or just come out with something and you're like, what the fuck? Yeah. And yes. Again, Gemma, make a statement. Simon, ask a question.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask actually next about the Worm and His Kings, because this was the first thing of yours I read and was absolutely blown away by, frankly. I mean, it's a really incredibly rich and original piece, and there's the setting in the sort of subterranean homeless communities of New York. There's the love story, or even the love quest, that's kind of driving Monique into the unknown in pursuit of her partner, and then there's the Lovecraftian cosmic horror element, the cult, and what lies beyond that. And any one of those elements would have made a fascinating and compelling story by itself, but together they create this, something which is even more extraordinary. So, I mean, what was the starting point of all that? Because there were so many. Any one of those aspects would, be the starting point. Could be the starting point of a wonderful story. But where did it start, and how did it kind of, these different elements kind of synthesize together?
It started with the lore. Funny enough, I had these ideas about this kind of millions year spanning situation that was really just beyond humans.
Right.
So I had that background, and I had to try. I wasn't sure how to approach it though, because that's not really something that you can easily get humans to end up interacting with necessarily. And it did take a couple tries. I tried writing it as a short story, but the character with that just felt forced. It wasn't working. And I kind of set it aside for a while. And then I think I was working on a different story, a different short story, and something about the character in that inspired Monique. And then kind of a lot of the rest of it started to unfold. And I still to this day cannot remember where Donna came from. I cannot, she just always existed for some reason, but I just cannot remember where that started with her. But yeah, so once I figured out Monique, that's kind of where everything else began to unfold. It's like, okay, so she would approach it like this because of this, and then this would happen. Yeah. And it took a few tries to even get that part right, because I knew the second half of that book was solid. I knew exactly what was going to happen. even just getting her to that halfway point, though, was just, it took a few tries of like, okay, how am I getting her here? How is she getting here? I knew why she was doing all this stuff. It was always for Donna, but like, you know, what steps of this to encounter? Because I really didn't want to overwhelm the reader, but I also wanted them to be encountering something new each chapter, to be learning learning something new, either about the worm stuff or about Monique each chapter. So it's just kind of and so the reader, Monique's descent ends up having to be the reader's descent. So that was like, that part was very purposeful from the beginning. And it was just a matter of trying to figure that step out. But yeah, it started with the lore. That was the very first thing.
Yeah. That quest into the underworld in pursuit of the person you love. I mean, that's pure Orpheus and Eurydice.
Yeah.
You know, it's catabasis. You know, let's go to the underworld to retrieve the person who is lost.
Yeah.
And
ended up feeling not to have been a particularly good idea after all.
Well, it's funny because I've seen people be like, well, that was dumb. And I'm just like, okay, I'm sorry you don't love anybody enough to go chase a monster into the sewers for them.
Exactly. Jesus. I mean,
or just,
again, the emotion. Again,
right, exactly. It's not an intellectual decision. It is an emotional decision to pursue somebody, even if it's at risk to yourself.
Yes.
And in this case, if you want to interpret it a certain way, at risk to your soul.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's an integral thread of horror. That, you know, whenever people are like, well, that's dumb, you know, it's like, I would never make that decision. I'm like, what, really? Really? Would you really never make that decision? I mean, people have problems, for example, with Barbarian, the recent film. But a lot of it rang very true to me in the initial stages, because I think we've all been in situations where it's like, why should I care about another human being? But shouldn't I care about another human being because they're another human being? You know, above and beyond the whole thing of, will politeness get me killed?
Right.
Yeah.
Will sort of making that leap of, oh, I'll bet you're not a serial killer, even though you look like Pennywise the Clown. You literally look like Pennywise the Clown. Maybe this actually is just a coincidence. Maybe this actually is just something weird that happened. You know? And before you know it, you're literally going down into the darkness.
Right.
And going, hi, hello? Hello?
I think a lot of people have that thing where if you're from a middle class background, there's often that thing where the worst thing you could do is to make a scene.
Yes.
So rather than do that, there's also, I think, maybe as well, if you come from a very comfortable and privileged background, there's the element of the just world fallacy, where things like that don't happen to me. Things happen to be people who are silly or who somehow deserve it, kind of thing. And of course, if you're not from a privileged background, if you are from a more marginalised background, you're going to call bullshit on both of those of those ideas, because one way or another they could get you killed.
Yeah.
And that's one of the funny things I've seen with The Worm and His Kings. I've seen some chatter like where it was like kind of rejection of Monique, the main character, because she's homeless.
Yeah.
And that's, I'm not sure if that's coming from the idea that, well, that shouldn't happen, which is fine, or the idea, which a lot of people have, but they don't say, which is that they feel if somebody's homeless, then they deserve it.
Yes. Yeah. Or that would never happen to me. Whereas,
as if you're not 3 paychecks away, like 3 lost paychecks away from losing everything.
Exactly. And either you do know it or you should know it.
Right.
And I think, again, this is something about horror, right? Horror reveals how thin the crust actually is.
Right.
Yes.
And that's the opening of, like, if the back of the book is just like, if you fall through the cracks, no one's there to catch you. Like, that is, and like, that's on a personal level and on a universal level.
Yeah, and it kind of also provides an explication of why people would. One of the big questions, and I think maybe one of the first stories that kind of tried to answer that question was David Drake's "Than Curse the Darkness," which was kind of like one of the big questions always left unanswered in Lovecraft's original text was, well, what kind of person would actually want to join a cult like that was all about destroying everything? Why would they? And then it was Drake's, Drake's story. It's all the people who are dispossessed or tormented or destroyed by colonialism, and then similarly,
Yes.
if like you said, if you are cast out into the outer darkness beyond that wonderful shining citadel that is civilization, well, the darkness is going to seem a lot nicer than civilization, and civilization is not necessarily going to seem like a thing that's worth preserving if it doesn't have a pulse for you.
Yeah, and God knows, I mean, it's always very funny with Lovecraft because he wants to believe that he's speaking from a place of privilege, and he is speaking from a place of privilege, but at the same time, he's the guy who was down to like half a can of something a day by the end of it.
But we still deal with that today, where people think that they're just temporarily embarrassed millionaires.
Yes. Yeah. I suppose
right.
Lovecraft was back to what he would call genteel poverty, wasn't he? His family had been richer and more. But of course, the other thing with Lovecraft is he always likes to pretend he's coming from a place of rationality, when in fact, certainly a lot of his attitudes are about even ones which are supposedly grounded in some. He would no doubt say his racism was it's just science that these races are inferior, but the language in which they're expressed is never rational. It's never sort of cool or cerebral. It's always like, oh my God, the alien horror of Italian people, or
the degenerate Dutch, right?
Right. It's almost a worship of the idea of reason, without actually adhering to it or really caring about it.
Yeah, it's a bit like a lot of I've had this with quite a few, a lot of the guys who are really into the new atheism in the early 2010s, who were usually straight white guys, but who were very big on rationality, and who regarded it as sort of the height of kind of moral courage to tell religious people they were all stupid or crazy. Like that's going to solve anything, but they would all be. There would be nobody so convinced of their objectivity and rationality as a straight white guy banging on about it, basically reacting emotionally to something.
Yeah, I mean, the baseline for me with rational atheism is always emotion. It's always like, it's like, on some level, fuck your magical sky god fairy, bullshit, because of something that's happened to you earlier in your life. It's like where you just want to destroy other people's. The thing that's keeping other people from, slitting their throats. Yeah.
And it's just this idea, I think, of they're like, I am emotionless, I am reasonable, I'm rational. Now here's the person that these people on TV told me to be angry at.
Yeah. Well, I think none of us want to think that we would enjoy being an authoritarian, that we would enjoy having authority so that we could, practice authoritarianness on other people. But the fact is, there's always a part of you that would enjoy that.
I doubt anyone has not had at least a few moments where they thought, if they would just make me absolute dictator for 1 month, I could sort all the world's problems, all the country's problems, and all the world's problems.
Yes.
And probably would exterminate certain people, but only only conservatives and people like that. No, nobody important.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But, it's always some bunch of people who are nobody important. It's we're all
if they
capable
just make
of
me witch king pope. Yeah, absolutely. and again, I think that's the the negative side of everybody's personality. That is something that horror, allows you to delve into, to go, like what are my worst impulses? What would happen if I indulged those?
It's what always makes me laugh when people say, people, oh God, horror writers must be such, sick, disturbed people. It's like, no, those horror writers are the healthiest people. Where else can, you'd be so pissed off at somebody that somebody could piss you off to the point where you'd seriously like to choke them. You can't do that without going to prison in real life, but sit down at your desk, write a story in which you kill them horribly, and you get to do the crime without doing the time. Basically,
I'm not saying that there aren't horror writers who have strange ideas, but whenever I see somebody, whipping out a gun in a corner store, it's usually not a horror writer.
True.
It's like, what do you mean you don't have my favorite kind of candy? This is America, or wherever. It's like, sir, why, sir and or ma'am, why why are you open carrying in a corner store in the first place? What is the point of this action?
Was about to that. I don't know if you ever saw that meme. It was like a Facebook error message. You cannot be in a relationship with your cousin. Cut to some guy with a baseball cap and a shotgun. I thought this was America.
That's right. I can be in a relationship with anything. And again, horror. Horror, fantasy, your brain.
And that's once again all we've got time for this evening. But if you tune in at the same time again next Thursday, you can hear the final part of our interview with Hailey Piper here on No Darkness But Ours.